Hello, juniors and seniors taking the literature AP exam. This is the second video that you should review before our review session on Wednesday, April the 19th. And this video is going to tell you all you need to know about the poetry analysis section, the first of the three essays that you'll need to write. So let me share my screen. And again, we're going to go to the content library of your English class where you'll find some AP Lit resources, right? Your teachers have put them there. So sharing screen here. All right, and let's go here, right? Again, content library, right? Lit AP resources. Last time we talked about the overview of the Lit and Comp AP. We looked at the multiple choice section here, some sample multiple choice exams, and I walked you through this PowerPoint. Let's do the poetry analysis review. This is the first of the three essays you'll need to write. So let me walk you through three sample prompts, right? And the way to forge good thesis statements on these prompts. And then we're going to look at these useful poetry resources page, right? So the first thing to do is on this page, what you're going to find is I have put in the 2018 poetry poem, right? With the prompt included. The 2000 and let's see, when was this from? The next one was also fairly recent, I believe, right? The Myth of Music, right? That was from the last 5-6 years, right? And then at the bottom, you have one more, the 2016 one, a Richard Wilbur poem, right? So let's start here at the very top, right? So you got three poetry prompts, along with structural models for what a thesis might look like, as well as a sample student thesis statements from students who actually took the AP and did well, right? So here's this first one, plants, and here is the prompt, right? This is what it's going to look like. Notice that it says suggested time is 40 minutes, right? And there is a poem, not too long. We're not going to read through the poem now. When we get together during that community day, we'll probably do a practice poem prompt together. For right now, though, let's take a look. I've put at the top here the prompt, right? And let's take a look at that. Let's take a structure. Let's take a look at a structural model for a thesis, and then let's see what an actual student thesis look like. So here's the prompt. Carefully read Olive Senior's 2005 poem Plants. Then, in a well-organized essay, analyze how the poet portrays a complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You may wish to consider the author's use of such literary techniques as syntax, diction, and figurative language. Okay, that's pretty much very standard for what a poetry prompt will look like. And let's break down a couple of things. First of all, you will probably find this important word, how, right? Let's highlight that. So how means technique, right? How does a poet convey some kind of idea, right? And you'll recall that in your literature classes, that is what we've always asked you to do, right? When we ask you to focus on DDIST, remember that? That annoying acronym, diction, detail, imagery, syntax, tone, right? That is how, right? The way in which authors use techniques or devices, they're also called devices, to suggest meaning, to suggest something about a theme or a character or whatnot. So you're going to see that word how, and that's what how means. It's an important word. How the poet portrays, and here's the first thing. This is the idea you're going to have to articulate for yourself. Let's make that yellow. The complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life, right? Okay, that is what you have to sort of forge in your response. You may wish to consider the author's use, right? The author's use of such literary techniques as, we'll highlight this, green, syntax, diction, and figurative language, right? So in your thesis statement and throughout your analysis, and these essays don't need to be more than 4 paragraphs, a brief intro, you don't need a lengthy intro, a couple of well-developed body paragraphs, and a brief conclusion, right? You'll need to showcase these two things, right? So what might that look like? In terms of forging thesis statements, right? This is what a thesis statement might look like, right? Something like this. Through, right? We'll make that green, right? Through these specific techniques that you're going to examine, right? Whatever it is, the speaker, and in poetry, we refer to speakers and not narrators, right? It's just a convention, and we'll review that again later. The speaker illustrates, right? And then it's whatever you come up with in terms of having read the poem, right? What you pinpoint as the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life, right? So in your thesis, ideally, you'll have those two parts. And you've heard this in your English classes, right? What is your textual focus? And what is your claim, right? It's the same thing here. This is the textual focus through these particular techniques, and here's the claim. Now, in terms of the techniques, they're asking you to consider things like syntax, diction, and figurative language. You don't have to consider all three. You could do two of those, right? It could be diction and figurative language, or syntax, which means sentence structures and figurative language. But do work from the ones that they suggest. Now, what might an actual thesis look like from an actual student who took the test? So here is a thesis of a student who did well on this prompt, right? And note here that this student uses 2 sentences for the thesis rather than 1. That's okay. Ideally, you want to try to boil it down in 1 sentence, but the mantra at AP is reward students for what they do well. So they realize that you're writing an essay under the pressure of time. A 40-minute, write an essay in 40 minutes. That's fast, right? So it's okay if you have 2 sentences as long as you're defining what needs to be defined. So let's take a look at this one, right? Here is the student sample, right? And notice the first sentence is essentially the yellow, right? The yellow asked about the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. And so this person defines that here, right? This is the yellow piece, right? The speaker warns the audience not to underestimate the clever machination of plants, characterizing them as manipulative beings whose goal it is to overtake the world, right? Then the next sentence, the writer pinpoints the techniques they'll use. The speaker argues his points through sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct audience addresses to the audience, right? So there are those 2 parts, right? This is the claim the speaker is making in yellow, excuse me, the writer's making in yellow, and in green is the particular techniques or devices that he'll look at. Notice that the person doesn't say through diction, personification, right? They define sinister diction, personification of plant life. You want to try to be specific as you can with your techniques. Don't say the author uses syntax. All sentences are one form of syntax or another, right? The use of choppy syntax or flowing syntax, right? The author uses figurative language. Be more specific, right? Through the use of this kind of figurative language, right? Or this kind of diction, sinister diction, define your terms, right? So there are the 2 parts, right? And when we meet on April 19th, I'll show you a full student sample essay to, what are you shooting for in terms of a strong essay, right? Okay, let's look at a couple of more here, right? Here is another poem, right? The Myth of Music for My Father. And there is the prompt for it right there at the top, right? And notice what I've done is I've taken that prompt and I've put it up here for us to look at, right? So let's look at the prompt together. The following poem is by Rachel M. Harper. Read the poem carefully. Then, considering such elements as imagery, form, and tone, write a well-organized essay in which you analyze the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family, right? So it again has these 2 parts. The prompt doesn't say how, but the how is implied, right? In this first part, considering how the poet uses such elements as imagery, form, and tone. So this is the technique piece, right? And we'll make that green again. So you want to choose from those 3, maybe look at 2 of those in depth, right? Imagery, form, and form just means structure of the poem, right? Write a well-organized essay in which you analyze, and here is the claim you'll want to forge, right? The relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family, right? So again, in terms of structural models for a thesis, here is again what you can do. I like it when students get their sort of techniques up front, right? Through these particular techniques that I'm going to consider. And notice we're using the word the speaker again. Poems have speakers, not narrators. The speaker suggests, this is the claim statement that you would want to make, right? The speaker suggests whatever it is you pinpoint as the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. You need to define those. Don't just repeat that prompt, define what that means after you read the poem and take notes on it, right? And again, you don't sit down and write a thesis immediately. You read the poem, you take some notes in the margins, and you take about 10 minutes to kind of craft a thesis and a brief outline before you start writing, right? So let's look at one more student sample, another student sample, right? Here is the thesis of a student who did well on this prompt, right? So notice how it follows this format, right? In the first half of the thesis, the student lays out these are the techniques or devices I'll look at, right? The how piece, how does the author suggest meaning, right? Through her use of comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery, right? Then the second one, Harper, the poet, conveys, and here is the claim that will be proven. Harper conveys a timeless and uniquely personal nature of music and its ability to evoke the emotionality of her childhood to her father, right? So again, notice the way in which it's a very specific response to the prompt. What is the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family, right? And it pinpoints the techniques that will be looked at, comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery. So all strong thesis statements, right, are going to consist of those two parts. The claim that you're going to make, right, and how you're going to prove that claim by assessing which techniques, which devices, right? One more, just to show you, right, how they're asking similar things over and over again, right? Here's from 2016. There is a poem, right? I didn't include the whole poem, but because we're just looking at the prompt, right? And here is the prompt. Let's take a look at that. Read carefully the following poem by Richard Wilbur, first published in 1949. Then write an essay in which you analyze how, there's that word, how, right? In which you analyze how the speaker describes the juggler and what that description reveals about the speaker. You may wish to consider poetic elements such as imagery, figurative language, and tone, right? So this is what you are trying to pinpoint, right? This first one, the yellow. Analyze how the speaker describes the juggler and what that description reveals about the speaker, right? So this is not asking for a thematic claim. It's just asking you to understand the speaker of the poem, right? The speaker who's a character, right? And that's fine, right? This is not asking for a thematic claim. It's a claim about the speaker, right? And here's the second part. You may wish to consider poetic elements such as imagery, figurative language, and tone. Again, we'll make that green. The how piece, right? How do those particular elements give us an answer to this claim we're asking you to make, right? So again, same thing, right? Get in the habit of structural models for the thesis statements. You got the, through these techniques that I'm going to look at, the speaker underscores, the speaker illustrates, or the speaker reveals any of those purpose verbs that I'm sure your teachers have taught you, right? The speaker underscores in this case, right? And there's the yellow. Whatever it is you pinpoint is revealed about the speaker given the speaker's description of the juggler, right? Now, again, let's see, what would a good thesis look like? Here is a thesis from a student who took the AP and did well, right? So I pulled the thesis statement out from the entire essay just so we can look at the structure of a thesis here. One more time, this is the last one. And notice how this first half is defining the techniques that this person is going to look at. Through utilization of frequent alliteration and somewhat off-kilter rhyme, as well as diction evoking an almost spiritual level of power in reference to the juggler, the speaker creates an image of a juggler managing to overcome gravity, to lift spirits as well as objects, and reveals their own inability to overcome dull, monotonous days, forever lacking brilliance. So this is the overall claim, the second half, right? And that's yellow, right? Now, one of the first things you're probably noticing about this thesis is like, well, that seems pretty wordy. It is fairly wordy, but again, the AP mantra is give students credit for what they do well. And in the first half of the thesis, the student defines well the techniques they'll look at. In the second half of the thesis, the student articulates the claim they're going to make about the thesis, about the speaker of the poem, right? So it's addressing the two parts of the prompt quite well. Now, obviously, if this student, right, had a few days to work on an essay, that thesis statement would probably be more compact, more concise, You've been taught to be as concisely precise as you can. That's good advice. But here, the relative wordiness is outweighed by the substance, right? And the pinpointing of technique and the articulation of the claim and so on, right? So you can count on all of these essay poetry prompts to look like this, right? And they're always asking you to establish a claim and pinpoint how specific techniques or devices or elements, those are all synonyms, suggest that claim, right? So I hope that helps in terms of understanding the structure of a thesis and what it might look like. Two more things for this video, right? Right beneath this poetry analysis review, we have this page, useful poetry resources, right? And you should definitely spend time with these, right? The first one includes a list of useful poetic terms. And when we open that, open up, right? I have given you this list of poetic terms, and I've highlighted yellow the ones that you should probably familiarize yourself with before the test. Even the multiple choice might ask you some things about alliteration or assonance for some of the poems, right? And so on, right? So alliteration and assonance, those are sound devices, right? Blank verse, caesura, you're like, wait, what's that? Just review, right? There's not gonna be a whole bunch, right, on blank verse, but there might be something, right? Connotation, consonants, couplets, denotation, right? Some of these you should feel fairly comfortable with, right? Like figurative language, right? Reverse, hyperbole, exaggeration, an image, an imagery, you know that. Irony, metaphor, ode, onomatopoeia, oxymoron, parody, personification. You get the picture, right? So review those, know those terms, right? Some of them you will know and you won't need to review it all. Others you might spend a little bit more time with, right? And then I've also included on this page tips on reading poetry and writing poetry. Let's just walk through this real fast, right? First of all, go through the poem at least a couple of times and remember that you can write on the test booklet, right? Read the prompt first, then read through the poem and circle things that might help you address the prompt itself. Always pay attention to the title. Titles are always important, right? Particularly with poems, right? A poem is a compressed meaning, right? Think about first and foremost who is talking, the speaker of the poem, right? What can we tell about their age, their gender, their station in life, their opinions, their feelings? The speaker is the character who's talking to you, right? To whom is the speaker talking? Just to the readers, to someone else, right? What is the listener's relationship with the speaker? What's the dramatic context of the poem, right? Is there an occasion for it? Is there a setting, a time, a place, a season, a situation? So what is the overall, right? Is it commemorating someone who died? Is it a love poem, right? Is it a poem about jealousy, or is it a poem about some kind of conflict with family, right? So what's the dramatic context? And similar to that, what happens during the poem, right? Is there conflict, right? Is it internal or external, etc., right? What motivates the speaker to speak now and the tone he or she uses? A lot of this is about the speaker and the occasion. Someone is speaking, right? There is some kind of situation, right? You want to try to unravel that. How does the language of the poem contribute to its meaning, right? Is there something distinctive about the poem's diction, right? Are words repeated, sounds, phrases, ideas, right? How is the poem organized? Is it a sonnet or a villanelle? Don't worry if you don't know those terms, but is there a specific structure? Are there two stanzas of equal length, right? And remember, a stanza is basically the equivalent of a paragraph in poems, right? Is it free form? Are there complete sentences? Do patterns of rhyme and rhythm contribute to the meaning and affect the poem? A lot of times they don't ask you to write about rhyme or rhythm, but if you feel comfortable doing so, you can showcase your understanding of how rhyme and rhythm contributes to the overall understanding of the poem. And then, of course, themes, right? Are themes stated or are they implied, right? Can you make a generalization about life or human nature from the poem? What idea is the poet communicating to the reader about maybe the relationship between lovers or family tensions or some kind of political issue or some relationship with nature, whatever it might be, right? So those are some quick things to think about as you are reading poetry, right? Okay, let's go back to this page real fast. What I've also included here are 2 sample poetry prompts, right? And these are things that you can do to practice on your own. We will probably do a poetry prompt together on that community day, as I mentioned, on April 19th. But if you're going to practice, right, what you can do is one of 2 things. You can do a full response to one of these 2 prompts, or both of them if you want. Remember, put yourself on the clock. You don't want to spend more than about 40 minutes, 45 at most, with an essay. Always take 10 or 15 minutes to plan your essay, and then use the rest of the time to write it out furiously. Remember, short intro, short conclusion, and then 2 body paragraphs, maybe 3 body paragraphs, right? You're looking at 4 or 5 paragraphs response, right? If you want to practice another way, you can do detailed outline responses. You can take about 20 minutes to read and annotate the poem, and then you can hammer out a thesis statement and provide topic sentences for your 2 or 3 body paragraphs and indicate the evidence you would use for each body paragraph, right? So those are 2 ways that you can practice in terms of the poetry prompt. Okay, so that takes us through the poetry analysis and poetry resources section, right? In the next video, I'll talk about the prose analysis section.